Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session of dtalks or disruptive literacy talks as we are continuing this journey of discussing ideas that would disrupt the challenges that we face with respect to meeting the goals of SDG 4. It is important to also talk about the major challenges which the world faces. The pandemic, of course, is at this point at the foremost. And what the pandemic has shown us is that if we are not building a world which is sustainable, if we are not developing a world which believes in inclusive development, in maintaining good relationships within the society, of respecting of diversity, then it is going to cause a lot of problems. And this is evident in the other crises that the world faces with respect to climate change, conflict, violence, extremism. And the pandemic is, we can say maybe a symptom of how we do not have a sustainable relationship among each other as human beings, but also with the environment around us. So sustainability education is something which is very important, and at all levels. We are talking about foundational literacy and numeracy and foundational education, but sustainable education, foundational education will not be, sustainable if you're not talking about making education kind of create change in how today's world is. So to speak on this, we are joined today by a very special guest. He is the co-director of Sustainability Education, which is an organization working in the field of sustainability education. And the speaker today has traveled around the world, has worked with schools and government agencies across the world, including in Africa, Latin America, and Asia as well. And he has a lot of focus on education in conflict settings as well. So we are very privileged to be joined today by Mr. Andrew Watson. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today, and we are very much looking forward to your presentation and having certain discussion points with you.
Well, thank you very much, Mashood. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I join you actually from Jerusalem. That's an image of Jerusalem you see on the left, where I am also co-director of a K through 12 1,000 student school in Palestinian East Jerusalem. The reason this slide is here alongside a picture of the Venerable Dalai Lama is because when in my fortune to have traveled around the world, I seem to have developed some of the capacity, some of the affinities, some of the attributes, one hopes, of some of those experiences. So I like to, or I've come to describe myself as a Judeo-Christian Buddhist, of all things. That's me on the right, by the way. And that's important if we go to the next slide, because I think for me, education, and I'm actually from London originally in the United Kingdom, but I'm an artist, I'm a painter. And I became a teacher because I discovered something called the International Baccalaureate. But both through my art and through my education, I think this is, and I've only come across this 20 years ago when the Dalai Lama wrote An Open Heart, when he talks about what we need to do to change our mental perceptions and mental attitudes, and how that can then lead to real differences in our lives and therefore those lives of people around us. And I think when we talk about sustainability education and the future of the world itself, I think adopting a different mindset, embracing a culture shift in how we live our lives and how we can therefore influence others around us becomes a very central part of the potential of having any kind of future, and therefore have the potential of our children to have a future as well. So this is kind of a real mantra for me, and it's something I kind of try to cling on to and hold on to, and therefore also share with my colleagues in and around the school. But it's not all to do with beauty and philosophy. Sometimes the will to do something different, especially in relation to education, which is a sacred moral purpose for me, comes from another area. So if you go on to the next slide, I started my teaching career in Jerusalem as well, 23 years ago, 1998. But also, I took it upon myself. This is an image on the left. Some of you are far too young to remember what this is. This is the Berlin Wall when it came down. And so when I heard the Berlin Wall was coming down, I got in a car with some friends from London, and we drove over and we started knocking it down. But before I saw the wall, I heard this noise like this, and there were thousands of people lined up against the wall, chipping away. And I think that was a metaphor for me to say that every single person can make a difference if they have the courage and the determination to do so. So that's another sort of very strong input. And one of the challenges I face in education is explaining to people that A, it's their responsibility, and B, they have agency in making change. On the right hand side, and thank you, Mashoud, for mentioning the graphic reality of conflict. When I was in Israel in 98 to 2001, we also lost friends in bombs and from shootings. And I think then one is left with a very profound moral choice. Are you held prisoner by that anger and that pain and suffering, or do you allow yourself to be liberated by it, and not held captive, and then can you find the courage somewhere within you to double your efforts to stop it happening again? Okay, so on one hand, we've got something which we don't want to happen again, such as the appalling cycle of conflict we see, and on the other hand, we have the most graphic and urgent challenge of our time, which is climate change. So if you move on again, please, to the next slide, you'll see two other reasons why I went into education. On the left-hand side, you have my two daughters. People say they look like their father. You might question that. And then on the right-hand side, you see the globe itself. So obviously the two ideas are connected. We need to create a better, more peaceful world for our children. And it doesn't get more simple and more than that when you talk about a reason to get up in the morning and a reason to do something that might have an impact beyond the self. And the kind of education I found, which is the education of the International Baccalaureate and the United World College Group, is exactly about that, an unapologetic ideology to something that transcends the self, to a better and more peaceful and more sustainable world. Next slide, please. So here we are. This is an image that we use in our sustainability education summits. This is kind of where we are with the world at the moment, right? There was just so much consumer-led, unnecessary behavior that the whole structure of the world is about to crack. And not least during the time of COVID, where you have these bizarre, what are in my view, because I'm working at a learning organization, which is what a school is, these bizarre ideas that you can provide an opinion without evidence and cling to it, even though it damages others. And I'm talking about things like vaccinations and attitudes towards science in a post-truth world, as some have called it. And also attitudes towards the idea that I need to buy, I need to consume, that there is only one way of doing things. Well, unfortunately, the overwhelming evidence from the world's leading experts, including from the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership, who are one of our partners in sustainability education, the Cambridge Institute, by common consent, one of the world's leaders in the field, they say that if you keep doing this, you ain't going to have a world. And you can't get more simple than that in terms of message. Next slide, please. So what are we going to do about it? Well, fortunately, there are some very bright, intelligent, and focused people around the world from lots of different sectors who understand and understood quite a long time ago that you need to have a plan. And they've articulated this plan in the Sustainable Development Goals, which are, I think, an amazing set of very coherent objectives to how you can address the problems that we currently face. But the issue is that we're running out of time. Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership say we've got about another 9 years before we reach a tipping point. You can see the effects of this on your television screens and on your news reports. All the symptoms they describe, which will swallow up the earth, are happening now around us. The question is, are we paying attention? Are we doing anything about it? So whilst education, some educational systems, for some reason, maintain a priority, or seem to maintain a priority, on rote testing and regurgitation of what constitutes fact. The ability to adjust and change one's own existence, and to develop all the attributes which allow you to develop a safe and hopefully fulfilling life. And note I'm avoiding the word wealth. Have not necessarily been addressed by education. Education is still stuck in a paradigm of 180 years ago, based on the Western ideas born of the Industrial Revolution. It's got to change. The question is, can we change fast enough? Because as far as I can see, the world of education is something of a monolith. Next slide, please. So here's just because this is the sort of general focus or specific focus of this talk. This is SDG 4, where we aim to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Well, even with that, the idea that we're promoting lifelong learning opportunities while killing the world around us is an obvious paradox. But the real question for people who lead schools, who lead education organizations, universities as well, who lead policy making in governments, is, do you know that this exists? Or to what extent are you guided and led by this principle of education? Do you believe in equitable quality education? We've already seen in some parts of the world in the last couple of weeks, education regressing, or attitudes towards education regressing, in terms of this particular SDG. I mean, there's another view. There's always another view. One of the views is this is a post-colonial view written by the victors of the Second World War, that the UN are simply promoting a westernized vision of education. I get that, but the world is dying at the same time. Next slide, please. So over here in particular in Jerusalem, you see, I think we need to be suspicious of education, because the history of education is especially in the last 180 years or so of formalized education, it is by no means a success. And I think we need to challenge the idea that it has been. Most of the leaders who are leading the world at the moment, including some of the populist tyrants, have all been to school. And for some reason or other, they haven't gathered that they have a responsibility beyond themselves. That's what I think. That's what Alan Rushbridger of The Guardian described populism as the rejection of complexity. Well, like it or not, the world is a complex, fragmented place. And if the world is a complex place, then so should the responses be. By which I mean the responses need to be connected. So in Jerusalem, we tell this story about how one of the greatest, if not the greatest, sin against humanity, the Nazi Holocaust, was led by people who've been educated. Well, that's not a very strong endorsement of the system that produced them. Next slide, please. And if we go back even further to Henry Ford, the guy who created the first mass-produced car, if you asked people what they'd wanted, they would have said faster horses. But Henry said, no, I've got a different idea. Here's a car. If you ask people what they want out of education, essentially they're doing the same thing. In general, they say we want faster education. We want to do more faster. We want to put more in to the system. We want students to do more. They haven't thought about challenging the system itself, and that's what sustainability education seeks to do. Next slide, please. And COVID-19, in that extent, has simply been an accelerator towards a different kind of sustainable school, where you actively, and we, as an organization, actively challenge the orthodoxy of education, as I've described it. We say, why do you need a school? Why do you need a school building? If you've got access to Wi-Fi and you've got the ability to create virtual classrooms, why do you need a school? Let's just ask that fundamental basic question. There are good answers to it, like, well, you need to socialize, but you don't need to do that in school. You can do it somewhere else. Why don't we use technology to make connections between people and society rather than creating places where they're outside of society? There's a very strong, simple proposition that we hold to in sustainability education, and it is this: that schools have a choice whether they want to be the mirror of society or the change agent of society. So let's start with the school. Why do you need to have a school? And let's look at how learning happens. If we go to the next slide, please. Then, to what extent is our experience of education guided by connections? To what extent is it guided by the Sustainable Development Goals? If we believe and understand that the Sustainable Development Goals are a good indicator of where we need to go as a world. To what extent are they reflected and mapped out in our educational experience that we provide for our children? So here is a model, particularly from Compass Education, one of a number of partners that we have as Sustainable Education who are doing great work in the field. The whole experience of education for students who buy into the Compass philosophy is shaped
Yes, Andrew, can you hear me? Are you able to hear me?
Hello, sorry, I'm back on. Am I back on live, Mashood?
Yeah, yes, Andrew. Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Sorry about that. I got cut off. Sorry, I don't know where. I'll try and pick up where I left off. So the question is, for educational organisations, to what extent, and for any organisation, to what extent is what you do shaped by these Sustainable Development Goals? Because if that is the future of the world, if we acknowledge that that is a good model for the future of the world, then surely how we prepare our young people to engage in the world should reflect that, with all the wonder and all the challenge of the complexity that brings. We need students who enjoy complexity, who can make connections between different subject areas. So if we go to the next slide, please, we'll see some progress has been made in relation to SDG4. It's true, but the extent to which that progress and momentum is integrated and consistent across different countries still leaves questions to be answered, of course. And it's not helped by hegemons or power brokers being challenging SDGs in their essence. They're not there to be challenged. Gravity exists. Let's get real about this. So what does that mean for an organization? What does it mean for a school? Let's have a quick example at the next slide, please. It's a mindset. So this is an example of what happened in the school I'm currently in. It's about observing, about understanding context, about raising awareness and consciousness of an issue, and then applying things with all those attributes that leadership and therefore student leadership should be encouraged to and to acquire and nurtured in the pursuit of, such as determination, perseverance, being principled, being focused, being connected, being balanced. There are the kind of attributes that the International Baccalaureate talk about in pursuit of our goals. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see something about a theory of action. You need a plan, you need a theory, and the theory needs to be connected. These are the kind of ideas that we share in sustainability education. Because if you want to create an opportunity for shift, you need to help people understand what it looks like in their own context. I can't take a model that might work in Italy or in China or in Canada and superimpose it in Jerusalem. The answer can also always be found in context, but there are some global principles to apply. Let's move a couple of slides on, shall we? Because I'm aware I'm running out of time. So let's go to the next one as well. So here we have a barren wasteland. The barren wasteland can be something that creates dissonance. It should create dissonance, but it can create a lack of engagement, disengagement. I don't care. I don't like what I see. And the mindset is, well, not what is it now, but what could it be? And that's always going to be the great challenge in education. And that's why challenging not only the where, whether you need a building in education, but the what of education, what we study, and do we study in a way that reflects the fierce urgency of now and the Sustainable Development Goals, but also the how. If students are brought to the threshold of their own mind, rather than being told to regurgitate facts, then they have an opportunity to shape their own existence. So, for instance, in all the schools that I work with and all the schools that sustainability education works with, the student leadership is a central and principal part of the focus in how we move forward. They have to be involved in the planning and implementation of their own future, because guess what? That's what they've got to do in the future. And I think I'm going to pause there and invite Mashood to ask any follow-up questions, if I may.
Thank you, Andrew. We do have more time, so in case you would like to continue with the presentation, we'll be very happy to take questions after that as well. It's completely your wish.
Okay, very good. Well, let's go on to, if we go to slide 18, can we do that, please?
Yes.
Which is, I think, 2 down. Well, yeah, there we go. So sustainability education does 3 things. First of all, we hold summits, and the summits bring together leaders in international and national systems of education, national and international systems of education, with policymakers and leaders in business and industry, and most particularly with students. You could call it the Greta Thunberg effect. And students, therefore, comprise 40% of the 100 people who attend our summits. We limit it. We limit the number to about 100 because of the nature. Outcome of that is understand they're brought to a position where they realize they need to change what they do. They need to challenge what they do, and they need to shift in culture, in organizational culture and other types of culture. And then after our summits, we create aftercare. We help schools and organizations get to where they need to get to next by creating networks, but also advice about what you can do, for instance, to make if you have a building and if you want to stay with your building, how to make your building a far more carbon neutral, indeed carbon negative space, which can then become, by the way, a way of creating a new income stream. So it's all to do with creating sustainable, network connected systems. Indeed, it is systems thinking in its purest sense. So we've created our summits, we create aftercare and networks of aftercare, but then the natural progression, again, accelerated by COVID-19, is to say, well, what is the future of a school? What is the next kind of iteration of education? And we say, and here is our little model that we're working on, that you have the world at its center. You have the world. And connected to the world in the next circle out is the idea of student well-being. Student well-being and by which I mean their mental, physical, and spiritual well-being is something that needs to be at the center of experience. If COVID-19 has taught us anything, it is that less is more. Spending too much time, as perhaps some of us are doing now, by the way, he said with some irony, online, on a screen, isn't good. Let's create space. Let's create space where we can have a mindful approach to our own existence and our responsibility to each other, as well as our rights in the world. The right to learn, for instance. So the whole idea is that of our sustainable school is that we take away the need for a physical space, which has hitherto been called a school. But we retain an idea and a commitment to student well-being at the heart of what we do. There might be a community hub where people congregate, but a community hub would be a multi-purpose space. It could be I was going to say a shopping center, but we're kind of moving away from that too. But the point is, it's a place which is accessible and multi-purpose and multi-use, and is used on a continuous basis rather than for X percentage of a year, like in my experience, many schools are. It's not good business to keep a space empty, let's face it. But essentially, that you could argue that in our model for a sustainable school, the day is split up into 3 parts. The first part of the day is taken up by interconnected learning, multidisciplinary learning that is online. And the great advantage of that is you can get the world's top practitioners reaching hundreds, thousands of people at once. In the afternoon, we have hubs, community hubs, where students congregate and work in partnership with local business and local industry to address particular lines of inquiry. So for instance, in a pilot we ran here in Jerusalem in summer, our students, who were taken from marginalized communities in and around the city, worked with a local supermarket. And the question they were asking the supermarket, which they had to engage with and inquire about for the next 2 weeks, was, how can we make your supermarket more sustainable? And in finding answers to those questions, they had to go into their multidisciplinary learning from the morning sessions. They had to ask themselves what the impact and implication is of learning environmental systems and societies on the way that a organization, a successful, from a financial perspective, organization, does their business. And then the evening, the time is there for personal reflection. Deep reflection is where deep learning happens. And that reflection is both self-reflection, peer reflection, and reflection in groups. And all these ideas are drawn, they're not accidental, they're drawn on best practice and models and international education and research that follows. And our vision for the sustainable school is that we will have 50,000 students in a sustainable school by 2022. The name of this school is the Empower Global School. That reflects one of the partnerships we've engaged in with the Empower School of Health, who have been doing this kind of work in the health sector for a long time. So it's about connected systems thinking, which change the orthodoxy of the way things are happening in the world. The other wonderful USP about this particular model is that there is a fee, but for every fee-paying student, we get a scholarship student from somewhere in the world. It's a 1+1 model. And if you want, there's another USP, which is this. When students work in the community in the afternoons in project-based inquiry, in partnership with business and industry, those groups are by stage, not age. So you might have a group of students, 20 students, who are between the ages of 12 and 20. That, again, reflects good research that's been going on for 20 to 30 years, but also it creates the possibility for interesting and sustainable learning relationships within that group. Last slide, please. So this is us, and this is what we do. I think one thing we've learned over the last 8 years of our being is you can't do it on your own, of course. So we're very happy to make connections with Global Dream and the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership and various universities and schools around the world. It's about doing it together. But I think we're very clear and unapologetic in our understanding that we know where we need to get to. And with that, I think I will close. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for this presentation, which has been really thought-provoking, and it is quite remarkable, the ambition and the passion with which sustainability education has been working in some of the most difficult contexts as well, and working with change makers, with the young people who are going to be future change makers. It is again something which often gets lost in mainstream education, and we talk about foundational skills, and we talk about learning poverty, etc. But that one quote where you said that reading, writing, and arithmetic is important only if it allows people to become better humans. So that's a very strong point, and thank you for sharing this with us and our audience. There were some questions that we had with respect to one point which you made, which was that the organization is working with the concept of sustainable schools, and it is that physical space in which a lot of work is done, in which a lot of the knowledge building and the children. And you talked about how now, because of the pandemic, also this restriction to space is no longer required. And so, would you like to share a bit more about how, as we go forward, where we are seeing more and more adoption of online learning, digital learning, what would be some of the things that have worked with this with this model of remote learning, with respect to sustainability education, and what do you feel are still the gaps that need to be addressed in this?
Yes, thank you. Well, again, there's probably a series of connected answers to that. I think one of the things that anybody who's had to experience some kind of education in the pandemic realizes, and I did touch on this, is that less is definitely more. Many schools realize if not too late, that you can't create a classroom of everybody who's engaged in this kind of conversation. It needs to be a priority. People need to recognize that it's not easy to spend time in a place talking to a screen. Secondly, though, I think it does create very significant opportunities, although one has to be mindful that when you're talking about a K through 12 school like I've got, online education in kindergarten looks very different to an online education in grade 12. Although another question is, why should it, by the way? But what it does give you an opportunity to is to move to a more inquiry-led, collaborative process where students are given ownership of their own learning and responsibility and therefore trust, to engage in an investigation where they are doing the learning for themselves. Now, of course, we know anyone who's got children, I suppose over the age of 2, knows that young people are very capable of going to find that information for themselves. That's not a new thing, but perhaps integrating it into a learning situation and a learning environment is. So I've faced that kind of issue. I say, I'm putting forward the idea at the moment within our school of an experimental trial with a group of about 10 students, where we say, okay, we're going to take the teacher out of the room. Now, again, there are a few people who've been looking at that over the years in terms of their research, to take the teacher out of the equation and say, here is your project, come back in 2 hours, all right? This is a group of grade 9 students. Come back in 2 hours and tell us what you come up with. Sugata Mitra does that. There's a chap called Sugata Mitra who did a famous hole-in-the-wall project in Mumbai. And he's taken that a bit further by saying, let's just leave the question with the students. What do you come up with? You see people, and then the parents. So you ask where are the sticking points in that? Of course, parents, essentially, it's a very conservative bastion, education. It's very, very tough to make changes in it. And parents are part of the sticking point. The question is, are they part of the problem or part of the solution, of course? Because we all want the best for our children. So letting go of that idea that you need a certain number of A-levels at a certain number of grade, or an IB diploma at a certain grade, you need to go to a certain kind of university for a certain reason. All of this has to be challenged directly. And if you have the right, well, I'm going to be careful about using the word right, but if you approach the question of education differently than what I found, and certainly this is true of my daughters who went through an IB diploma education, they come up with those answers on their own. And well, the outcome of that is that they're self-regulated, self-driven, focused, and therefore also able to monitor their own mental, physical, and spiritual health. That is the purpose, to create sustainable individuals within a sustainable system who recognize the irrelevance of a system that was built for a different era. I think I may have gone off the question a little bit, but I hope I've come back to it as well.
Thank you, Andrew, for sharing your thoughts on that aspect. And yes, in fact, I was you covered this point of kind of addressing the resistance which might come from parents with respect to any kind of innovation in education, being a product of an education system which often might be very traditional and rigid, and to have your children go through that program might have bring in certain questions in their mind. But here I would like to also share about what about teachers when we talk about sustainability education. What has the experience of your organization been, or of maybe of other organizations as well who are working in the area of sustainability education, when they are with respect to teacher training? Is that a challenge which is faced with respect to resistance from teachers, and how has that kind of change in attitudes and beliefs towards sustainability education through teacher training would you like to share maybe some successes or some learnings in that area?
Sure. Well, I think any kind of culture shift, especially an organizational culture shift, arguably especially in a school, with some irony, I reflect, because you might think a learning organization would be one which adapts and approaches change with some relish, can also reflect a quite conservative approach to doing something differently. And I understand why, especially in some national systems of education, where your career might be based on narrow symptoms of performance. I think I'm going to stick to that. Some narrow symptoms of performance that you think it's dangerous for me to do something differently. So of course, so you have a big idea, you have your why, you have your moral purpose. You think this is the shape of the world. Okay. And I understand this, because I'm a teacher too. You want to be given some support in grasping what it means for your own particular practice. So there need to be systems and structures and policies and procedures and professional development that supports the implementation of every single person's professional and indeed personal plan in meeting a different kind of agenda. So, for instance, in our school, and again, I've been here, I'm talking about Jerusalem, I've been here for 14 months. So after 6 months, we had a sustained, and after providing ongoing training with global experts, funnily enough, faculty members at sustainability education, on what integrating systems thinking looks like in schools and in different sections of the school, kindergarten, elementary school, high school. What does it look like for my own practice? We had a sustainability week where the expectation was that every professional, every employee in the schools, not just teachers, teacher assistants, administration, office staff, every single person had to engage in a professional sustainability project for a week, and then which continued beyond that week, but also had to adjust their personal practice. And that was brilliant because it could be something very, very simple, such as rejecting at a personal level the gift of a plastic bag from a shop. Because it immediately raises consciousness, not just in you, but in the person who's offering you that plastic bag. It raises awareness of your need to find an alternative, because you can't just get rid of something. You have to find a better alternative for it to work. And then for you to share that with someone in your family or a colleague, so you maximize or optimize the impact of your change. And if you put that in a professional perspective, then you can also build an expectation, as I have done, into something we call a growth cycle. So you change the dimension of appraisal or evaluation of a teacher, and you talk about a virtuous cycle of improvement, because that's a system thinking approach to profession, to valuing a professional, a fellow professional. And you say, well, where does something like the compass model I illustrated earlier fit into your own practice? And once you make it a requirement for people to do that, then you have an extrinsic motivation as well to do it. But through the extrinsic motivation comes the intrinsic understanding that actually both my understanding of what I'm doing and my enjoyment of it, and that last part is extraordinarily important, my enjoyment and my fulfillment in what I'm doing improves. And I think that's the kind of systemic approach to change that we do here in Jerusalem, and which many of my colleagues do in the schools that they support in many different parts of the world. But it has to be an integrated, connected system. You can't do things in isolation. It has to be meaningful, and it has to be sustainable.
Thank you, Andrew, for your thoughts on this. When we talk about sustainability education, there is a sustainable development goal 4.7, which specifically talks about that all learners should have the capacity to kind of to be change makers, or to be active agents of change with respect to achieving the SDGs. While the values that we might be trying to inculcate are universal in nature, are global in nature, but the problems of sustainable development do differ, and require contextualization. What has been your experience and of your team with respect to contextualizing the sustainability education programs across different countries? What does that process look like, if you would like to share for our viewers, that that if how do you yourself review that, okay, we have to some extent or to a lot of extent been able to contextualize our program to the local situations?
Okay, thank you for that question. I just want to mention briefly I think what happens within a school perspective. So part of the systemic approach is that you have, or I've appointed, sustainability coordinators in different sections of the school. And the sustainability coordinator in different sections of the school also applies to students. So there is a student sustainability coordinator. Student leadership, as I mentioned in my presentation, has to be at the core of culture shift and school change. From a SUSED, sustainability education perspective, it's about collecting the stories and capturing the learning of those stories, and then finding a way to share them. So we've had a series of quite significant and successful webinars, for instance, over the last 12 months. We also, obviously, as you can imagine, share some of these case studies as part of the program in our summits. It's very, very important. And they're not just success stories. They're stories about where things failed and went wrong. Okay, so creating that living network, that community of agency, is something we actively look to do, and that does include the most recent webinar series, was called Case Studies for Change, which attracted hundreds of practitioners from around the world. They share their stories, they make connections, and then they're supported in their own journeys. And what's really wonderful about that is you might have two very similar programs, because you can be doing an IB primary years program in Berlin just as you can be doing in Bogota, and those guys can make connections across their primary years program. So there's a lateral connection to be made, as well as a structural connection in terms of how to implement any kind of shift you want to make. So there are lots of strands and lots of connectivity towards the different sections of, I suppose, how one organizes and how one organizes an organization, especially a school, from the experience, the moral purpose, to the expectations, to the assessment, to the parent body. I think one of the key areas is, where do you place a concept of serving beyond the self, for instance? And lots of countries I've worked in and lots of schools I've worked with don't necessarily have a culture of doing that. And I would include my school here in that. So to what extent do you actually serve the community? Or indeed, how do you do it? Especially if I say that at the top of our website, we aim to serve our community. The question must always be, how do you do it? And I think in some respects, that's actually very, very simple. And what I've done just, in fact, today was the first day we started it here. We've brought in a service program and a requirement that every single student in the school must engage, and that's from grade 1 to 12, and we're working on kindergarten, must engage in a project that serves the community. And just launching an idea like that requires people to think about what it means. And every classroom teacher, therefore, must ask themselves the same question. And inevitably, that means the students ask themselves the question, and the parents ask themselves the question. And suddenly, you've got the flowers or the seeds, or at least the germination of culture shift and culture change in relation to implementing in context. You're on mute, Mashood. Mute?
Oh yes, yes. Thank you for thank you for letting me know. And if I may also ask that, where like this shift of culture which happens, do you see that the programs where we are working on sustainability education, could you, for our viewers, kind of share as to what kind of peculiarities, or what kind of improvisation needs to be done with respect to a program. So if we, for example, take a large country which is very diverse, a country like India, for example, so we see that the whole understanding of water conservation, for example, or the whole understanding of pollution or conflict is so diverse across the country. And you talked about that involving starting from the level of the school, but essentially if you want to if you want truly to stop these a lot of these global disasters, it has to be kind of taken up at the very large topmost level, at the policy level as well. In such a context, what would your thoughts be on how can certain frameworks work with respect to a region or a country which has very diverse problems with respect to sustainable development? How can sustainable education kind of be built that way, such that it's adaptive and flexible? Your thoughts, please.
Thank you. Well, I think you're right to suggest that the needs of, let's say, a country like India. I've had the privilege of visiting India and different parts of India a number of times. are so diverse and so multifarious that the first thing to do, and one might apply this to any kind of service project, is to try and respond to demonstrated differentiated need. There is not a one-size-fits-all solution. And in order to be able to respond to demonstrated and differentiated need, you first need to listen. So in order to listen, you need to engage. So from an organizational perspective, that is what we would seek to do. We would seek to identify, or people come to us and they say, how can you help us, right? And I think one of the principles of lending support is to instill a sense of empowerment and agency, as I touched on previously. And that an agency, and it's rather, we have this rather lovely badge in our school here, which it's our emblem for our school, and it says peace begins with me. So I could quite easily exchange that and say sustainability begins with me. So East Jerusalem, by the way, does remind me sometimes of some parts of certainly the United Kingdom. Some parts remind me of India. And one of the issues that we have here is sometimes a lack of respect for an otherwise beautiful natural environment. So things like litter are profuse. Things like plastic bag use are profuse. They're unchallenged. They're habitual. Similarly, the idea that you can do something with something like that, either reuse it or turn into something else, is not always prevalent. Now, I've never been to some of the apocryphal slums in Mumbai, but I've heard great stories about people turning day-to-day objects that they found into other creative use, right? And I think there's a lot to be learned from that kind of experience. Number one, I mean, there's a structural and political dimension as well, because why are you producing this stuff? You know, in Israel, for instance, the government are going to, I don't know, they're thinking about applying a levy on plastic bags. Yeah, we'll tell that to the guys in the market who give out thousands every single day. All right, how are you going to create compliance with that kind of thing? But I think when you go into any context or any school or any organization, the message is very simple. Sustainability begins with me. And I come back to the example I gave in my own school, where there were two expectations, one personal, one professional. And then developing an idea of what that agency looks like can be made by connecting with another in a similar context, whether in the same part of the world or not. And that is always, you're always creating connections, you're always thinking in systems. And the impact of that could be anything from deciding that I'm not going to use plastic bags, to turning lights off, to reshaping or repurposing objects that I've found. And that it's a mindset. It's a mindset shift that happens gradually over time. Yes, it can start with agency, which is individual agency. Inevitably, over a period of time, you need to build a community of change as well, and then support where necessary. I hope that answers, at least in part, what you were asking.
Yes, Andrea, and I think this clearly doesn't have a clear a clear solution in the sense that as the like you gave this wonderful framework or this template to think about how we can contextualize, but when it actually comes to the actual contextualization, there are so many different factors at play that you have to think about, and here, of course, we are talking about like all stakeholders, the businesses, the governments, the not-for-profits, communities working together on something with who all these stakeholders have their different politics and their different considerations. So it gets really complex in the ground, as I'm sure would be the case in any kind of initiative. Andrew, in conclusion, I would like to also ask you about how do we measure success with respect to achieving the goals of SDG 4.7? Because for 4.1, 4.6, we are talking about foundational literacy and numeracy. We've kind of figured out certain systems. There are PISA assessments. In India, there are like a lot of different national assessments, etc., which give you a clear-cut picture that, okay, this is the improvement, this is not the improvement, etc. While, of course, that those standardized tests have their own set of challenges and critics. How do we measure where we stand with respect to SDG 4.7 and any kind of experiences which have shown that, okay, yes, it is possible to measure?
Yes, thank you. That is a very important and pertinent question. I'll give two anecdotal stories. Firstly, a student who, as part of her extended essay, which is a project part of the IB diploma program, she went to Kenya to investigate a human rights question, to what extent had the Kenyan government implemented SDG 4. Okay, now the Kenyan government said that they had, and the UN agreed with them. But the student found different. She found that students were denied access to education based on the ability to pay, because they had to pay for things like uniform, they had to pay for pencils. And so she challenged this directly with the Kenyan government and the UN. And other than having a magnificent essay, which happened to get her to a great university, what it did is, for me, it shone a light on the idea that there's an expediency at political and leadership level, which always needs to be challenged, and it needs to be challenged on an evidence base. So the other example I give is the United Kingdom government, who are currently, how one politely describe it, botching the numbers as they prepare for COP, the COP summit in November, the climate change summit in November. And they're choosing not to include data such as emissions from aircraft. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially they're choosing to omit some of the largest emitters possible in the data that they present, and therefore claiming that they're leading the sustainable charge. Well, it's nonsense. They're not, right? So in terms of those more measurable, perhaps more reliable and measurable metrics in school, I think, and there are some great stories about this we do in sustainable education, stories about 20-year journeys in a school, starting with a flower pot in one room, the next year having 2 flower pots. I mean, again, I'm being simplistic about it, but that's essentially the journey we go on. For me, one of the metrics I've referred to already is the level of student ownership, student agency, and student leadership in the school. To what extent is there a clear mission, a clear goal, which you can see visible and audible and hear audibly around the school, which reflects that process? The idea that people are changing what they do. I had a great story yesterday or today from a student who said, "Mr. Andrew, what you're doing is changing the way my dad thinks." And I said, well, actually, it's not me who's doing that. That's you who's doing that. And for me, that is a great measure of success. Another great measure of success is what students go on to do in 2, 5, 10 years. When I came back to Jerusalem after 10 years away from my first time here, I met a group of students, and they were all engaged. One was working for Save the Children in Ramallah, another was working for the UN, another was working for Tony Blair's quartet. I'm not sure that's a measure of success, but let's not go there now. Another was working in water conservation in the West Bank, which is where they did their extended project when they were at school. And I thought, somewhere along the line, they bought into the idea that a better, more peaceful world is dependent on them and their passion and their expertise. And I thought that was very powerful. And I think every school, you certainly, leadership plays a big role in it, but the leadership really comes from the teacher champions and the students in the school. And that's where you'll see change, and that's where you can measure change best.
On that note, Andrew, we would like to thank you for this really wonderful and refreshing talk. I think one point which you mentioned, that emission and omission, kind of a Freudian slip there. But it's truly remarkable, the work which you and your team are leading There's so much that we have learned today, and all those people who are watching us live and who will be watching this video, while we talk about, we've had a lot of speakers to speak about foundational literacy and numeracy, what kind of curriculum, what kind of pedagogies, systemic transformations are required for that. But it's truly that from the practices of sustainable education has to be kind of integrated from the very foundational stages as well, because just like we are saying that foundational literacy and numeracy is a crisis, is an emergency, but the more tangible and more devastating emergency is just looming around us, and for that we actually also don't have a lot of time. So thank you for sharing your thoughts and the successes and the learnings and all the different ideas that you have shared. We hope that all of us who will be watching this also kind of learn and reflect on how such sustainable education practices can be replicated in their own context. Mr. Andrew Watson, thank you once again for joining us on dtalks.
Thank you very much.